Hello, class. Today, as following up our overview of our world to get you ready for adventuring, I'm now covering the races of our world. The sentient races, mind you. There are other things that, of course, exist, but we're counting the only things that we generally consider sentient, and members makes up the members of the cities. Now, at least this time, we'll be covering things that's blatantly obvious, but sadly, I'm also forced to go over the basics. Instead of going into details or interesting topics, I must cover the basics, because of course I do. So, as you know, before the Golden Age, what we call, well, simply the age before the Golden time before the Golden Age, only humans really existed. They were the only known race to exist upon the Earth that was sentient. This is commonly accepted knowledge and seems to hold up based on all records we know. During the Golden Age, things get a bit more iffy, but it's generally commonly accepted that they were pretty much only humans with maybe one or two exceptions. Then, when the fall happened and everything went down bot, as you know, the Golden Age ended, mutagenic radiation covered the land, you get the idea. All that happened. Then the races we know as came into existence. We'll go over them in order of what existed within the cities. First, we'll cover the humans. Now, the humans are technically two separate groups, as they are genetically somewhat distinct, but realistically we group them generally to humans due to their similarities. Pure strain humans and normal humans are considered two slightly separate groups, but generally normal humans seem to be genetically the same to the humans that came before the Golden Age. Unclear if they share the same genetic makeup of those during the Golden Age humans. They are generally susceptible to radiation and its mutagenic properties like anything else, and no special bonuses, negative penalties, or anything regarding it. Now, naturally, being humans, they naturally don't have to deal with certain other things that would take up their time getting skilled and used to doing, so they naturally tend to be more skillful than other races, at least in the beginning. This is generally complemented by the fact that they have a pretty baseline stats and abilities from all we know. They are considered somewhat of a basic race. Their pure strain cousins, which are about equal in population in the cities, are a bit different, as they naturally, the bodies have adapted to dealing with the mutagenic radiation. Noted, that's specifically talking about the biochemical that's been released upon our world we call radiation, not actual radiation like is in the spectrum of light. They're still vulnerable to that, but the radiation that we're generally referring to, the mutagenic kind, they are immune to. It simply will not mutate them, and specifically unique to pure strain humans, they take 50% less radiation damage from any source, meaning that they're generally pretty resistant against fighting it. This, however, comes at a cost, as well as potentially not being able to get any beneficial mutations, which most people say is always a double-edged sword regardless, but it is a thing. They also suffer from the fact that anything that would normally heal someone that uses radiation, such as a healing item from the Golden Age, is actually quite toxic to them and will actually hurt them to use, or at the very least will do no healing. So those two are the two human species. Telling them apart is actually extremely difficult, as generally the only thing that will separate them is some very, very minor mutations that don't even count as mutations in normal humans versus pure strain. But since they can just be random genetic quirks that just happen in humans or any race, it's almost impossible to tell, unless the normal human has gained some mutations. That is generally the only consistent way to tell them apart. Now, mammals are a bit different. It's making up the other of the three civilized races, as we call them. They are a bit funny. Most people accept the idea that they are simply humans who are mutated by the mutagenic radiation in some unique way that made them more stable than, say, other examples of it. This is the commonly accepted theory, as no true records of them exist before or during the Golden Age. So it's commonly accepted that they were created during the fall, like most races. However, some have claimed that due to their genetic hardiness and their immunity to radiation like pure strain humans have, and their general genetic consistency, they might have been created during the Golden Age as some form of experiment or citizen or something. No one's entirely sure on this one. Most accept the post-fall origin, but some have pointed out the fact that, once again, the mammals are immune to radiation would imply that they were actually pre-fall, and that they were purposely made, and that's why their genetics are hard, as we call them. They share the pure strain human's trait of possessing immunity to gaining mutations, and the downside of not being able to use healing items the same way. But they do not get 50% resistance like pure strain humans possess. They start out with a few sets of what could be considered mutations, although realistically they act more like biological functions, simply foot like claws and that type of thing. Things that only count as mutations in very technical terms, and don't really count as that, since they can't gain any other way except just being born with it. They are most like humans with the minor exception of their mutations as far as appearance goes, and are generally pretty human-like in most aspects. They commonly are just, as being one of the other civilized races, no one pays too much attention to them uniquely. They simply make up the 3 civilized races. Now we go on to the other 3 races of the setting, which are a bit more different. The mutant animals, which may sound that they should be similar to the mammals, but should not be considered the same. And in fact, doing so will often get you in fights, because don't call a mammal a mutant animal or vice versa. They hate that a lot. Mutant animals have a much more consistent origin than the mammals, as we know they were created from the fall of the mutant generation, mutating the animals that would become them into somewhat of a form of sentience, creating the mutant animals. As them a race, they are much more chaotic than the mammals, as they don't have a similar origin to humans, and they are 100% susceptible to radiation, as just nature is. They can get it normally, like a normal human would. They also start out with more mutations, with air quotes, I guess, than a mammal would, naturally. They are generally pretty basic. They have some minor penalties of using the old technology because they just weren't made for it, but overall, they're kind of basic and kind of sound like mammals, but don't get them confused again. They will beat you up for it very badly. I once got into a fight with a mammal because I actually called him a mutant animal, and that was a whole fight I got into. Anyway, now to the plant people. Most people, once again, accept that the plant people were created post-fall, as every evidence of their existence only shows up after that. However, some of the oldest plant people try to claim that they were actually the oldest race on the planet even before the humans showed up, and they simply got reactivated by the fall. There is almost no evidence, if any, to support that hypothesis, and most people, even plant people, accept it's probably just them talking out of nowhere. But regardless, they are, as far as anyone's concerned, mutated plants that have gained a form of sentience. These mutated plants have some bonuses to surviving in the regions where their plants are naturally native to, or environments more accurately. They are generally kind of tough, and generally don't start with that many mutations, but are perfectly susceptible to it like anyone else would be. They generally don't associate much with other races outside of other plant people, and are generally pretty aloof a lot of the time, often living just on their own. Then you have the mutants. The example, everyone knows where these guys come from. There was no question in the world on that one. Mutants are the examples of humans and potentially others, but generally considered to be humans, that were heavily damaged. Their genomes were just destroyed by the fall. The mutant generation twisted and warped their bodies and minds into configuring masses. Now, they are all still sentient, at least most of them, and generally have a form of consistency to them, but there is no consistency in their form. They are highly susceptible to mutation, radiation, and they just have effects all up everywhere. They are the most random of the races. True normality is not really possible within their group. As a note, they also, though they are more susceptible to radiation damage, they are also capable of getting more healing from radiation-based items. Kind of like the opposite of pure-string humans. But, they could potentially be the most numerous of the races, at least, though not inside the cities, but potentially outside, as their true numbers are not exactly known. This later analysis is currently unknown. Now, I've covered the 6 races that make up our world. Now, I'm going to have to go on a quick detour and point out this distinction I made very early on, where I said that the two human groups and the mammals were the civilized races, while the mutant animals, plant people, and mutants were the wild races. An odd distinction to make, but there is a reason for it. You see, it all goes back to the fall. When the fall occurred, of course, the cities were left somewhat standing, but they hid in bunkers for a few years to simply wait out the worst of the radiation. Now, when they came out, it was not as good as we currently have it, where it's only really located in a few regions, but it was survivable and passable. Then the first 4 cities were left with a choice. What should they do? Many chose the path of simply that this was a mistake and a bad idea, but the Golden Age was great, we should restore it and rebuild it. And that's what they started trying to do, to rebuild the Golden Age from those 4 cities. This would be hampered, though, by some people, particularly just deciding that this was clearly a sign that the Golden Age was a mistake, and technology and all this was a mistake and a bad idea. This what created known as the Civil War period, where the two factions would battle fiercely in order to decide the fate of the world as we know it. This would end up eventually leading to this would eventually lead to the victory for the cities, as we call it, as our first war. But this also led to distinctions of the civilized versus wild races, as the pure strength humans, normal humans, and mammals were, for the most part, aligned with rebuilding the Golden Age, where the mutant animals, plant people, and mutants were mostly aligned with destroying the cities and going back to a different, older way of life. This is what created distinction, as all of the wild, as what would become known as the savage forces that tried to escape, tried to destroy the cities and such, would be kicked out of the cities via the end of the war. While the races that side with the cities and those who side with the cities were allowed to stay in. This created a distinction that still kind of goes on to this day. Now, it's not a hard restriction, but you'll find members of all races and all different factions and groups in this world. But it is a distinction that exists in the world, simply put, because of this history and this living stain. Still, the civilized races overwhelmingly live in the cities, and the wild races overwhelmingly live in the wilds and not in the cities. There was very few actually laws keeping this way, especially in the Fifth City, that goes on for days about how it has no laws against this kind of thing because everyone's equal, but realistically there were very few laws in any other cities to begin with. This led to the distinction we now know today as. This is also what kept the cities kind of more focused later on, as a lot of the more rebellious elements early on were dealt with during that conflict. This wouldn't be the only conflict the cities would go through in their history, but it was perhaps one of the most grand, as it led to a massive degradation in our technology. As if it wasn't for certain actions that happened during the war, we might have went back even further in tech, as this war caused us to lose most of our Golden Age technology simply in the fighting. But that's all a story for another day. I was here to tell you about the races of our world, and I have done this. Next time, we'll cover a different subject in our world of perhaps equal, if not greater, importance. See you then.